Search for my dog! Where is my dog? Search everywhere!
Sir, I didn't see the dog.
What? Where is it?
I couldn't find it.
The Duke of Veltanov's wolfhound had not returned by nightfall. That alone meant nothing. Borya had wandered the estate grounds before, chasing foxes into the birch wood, returning at dawn with mud on his paws and a look of absolute satisfaction. But this time, when the stable boy came running with a pale face and shaking hands, he was not carrying a muddy dog. He was carrying a collar, Borya's collar, sliced cleanly through at the buckle, as though something, or someone, had removed it deliberately. Duke Radomir Tsvetnov crouched in the snow, turning the leather strap between his fingers. The cut was too clean for teeth, too precise for accident. Someone had been on his land. Someone had come close enough to reach his dog without a single guard raising an alarm. And that thought was far more unsettling than the missing animal itself. But it was what lay beneath the collar that stopped his breath entirely. A piece of cloth, embroidered with a crest he had not seen in 11 years. A crest that belonged to a man he believed was dead. Who was it? And what did they want? If you need answers, and trust me, you do, subscribe right now, because this story is only just beginning. The collar lay on the study desk, and Radomir had not moved from his chair in 2 hours. The fire had burned low. The candles had begun to drown in their own wax. Outside, snow was falling again over the Veltanov estate, soft and indifferent, covering everything. Hoofprints, footprints, whatever trail might have told him which direction the intruder had taken. He had sent 4 men into the birch wood at dusk. 2 had come back with nothing. 1 had come back with a torn boot. The 4th had not come back at all, and that detail sat in Radomir's chest like a stone dropped into still water, still sinking. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had commanded a regiment at 23, buried his father at 26, and managed the Veltanov estates alone through 3 consecutive years of drought that had broken older and wealthier men entirely. He had looked ruin in the face and not blinked. But this was different. This was not ruin. This was something that wore a face he recognized, and that made it far worse. The crest on the cloth was the Drevsky seal. House Drevsky, a name so thoroughly buried in the past that hearing it again felt like watching a dead man sit upright in his coffin. 11 years ago, Lord Alexei Drevsky had been condemned by the imperial court for treason against the crown. The sentence had been death. Radomir himself had stood in the courtyard and watched the verdict delivered. He had not watched the execution. He had told himself that was simply because he had no stomach for spectacle. But standing now in the guttering light of his study, with the Drevsky crest in his hand, he wondered if some quieter, more cowardly part of him had simply not wanted to be certain, because certainty mattered now. If Alexei Drevsky was dead, someone was using his crest as a message, which meant an enemy with knowledge, patience, and access to his land. And if Alexei Drevsky was not dead, then Radomir had spent 11 years with a very dangerous man still breathing somewhere, watching, and waiting for precisely the right moment. He stood abruptly, knocking the chair back. The sound broke the silence of the room like a crack of ice on a winter river. He crossed to the window. The estate grounds were white and still. The lanterns along the front path threw orange circles onto the snow, and within one of those circles at the far edge of the light, something moved. Not a guard. The guards moved in straight lines with purpose. This was slower, unsteady. A figure emerging from the darkness at the tree line, half bent, one arm pressed against its side. Radomir was already at the door before the figure had taken 3 more steps. He crossed the entrance hall in seconds, threw open the front door, and walked out into the cold without a coat. 2 of his men were already moving toward the figure from the east side of the path. He waved them back. Something about the way the figure moved told him that an approach with drawn weapons would end badly, either for them or for whatever chance he had of learning the truth. He reached the figure first. It was a woman. She was on her knees by the time he got to her. One hand pressed into the snow, the other still locked against her ribs. Her coat was dark wool, well cut but caked in mud along the hem, and her hair had come completely loose from whatever arrangement it had started the evening in. When she raised her face to him, he saw that her cheekbone was bruised, that her lip was split, and that her eyes, grey, steady, and furious, were looking at him with an expression that was not fear. It was warning. She said one word before she went completely still in the snow. One word, barely more than breath, but he heard it with absolute clarity in the cold night air. Drevsky. Radomir crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. Her pulse was there, faint but fast, like a bird held too tightly. He looked up at the birch wood, at the darkness between the trees that gave nothing back. He had lived on this estate for 31 years. He knew every trail, every fence post, every hollow in the ground where water pooled in spring. He had believed, with the particular arrogance of a man who has never truly been caught off guard, that nothing moved on his land without his knowledge. He had been wrong. He had been wrong for some time, it seemed. He gathered the woman from the snow without ceremony, one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back, and carried her toward the house. She weighed almost nothing. That concerned him more than the bruise on her face, more than the split lip, more than the name she had spoken. A person that Light had not been eating, a person that Light had been running for longer than one night. Inside he laid her on the settee in the front room and sent for the housekeeper and a fire. He pulled back her coat and found what she had been pressing against her ribs, a wound, shallow but ragged, along her left side. Not a bullet, a blade. Someone had gotten close enough to use a knife, which meant she had either been caught or she had allowed the distance. He stood over her and looked at her face in the firelight. She was young, late 20s perhaps, with the kind of bone structure that suggested old money and the kind of pallor that suggested genuine fear, however well she had hidden it in the snow. There was something precise about her features, something composed even in unconsciousness, as though her face had been trained from childhood to reveal nothing. He did not know her. He was certain of that. And yet the certainty sat uneasily, because he had also been certain for 11 years that Alexei Drevsky was dead. Who was she? How had she found his estate? How did she know that name? And where, in all the frozen dark beyond his windows, was Boria? The fire caught, and the room filled with warmth, and the woman on the settee did not move, and Radomir pulled a chair to her side and sat down to wait, because whatever she carried with her, whatever, truth had followed her through the birch wood and dropped her at the edge of his light. He intended to hear every word of it. He had a feeling it was going to change everything. She woke at dawn. Radomir heard the exact moment it happened. A sharp intake of breath, the sound of someone remembering all at once where they were and why, and then silence again, the careful silence of a person, deciding how much to reveal. He had not slept. He had sat in the chair beside the settee for the better part of 6 hours, watching the fire and thinking, and he recognized that particular silence, because he had used it himself in rooms where he did not yet know who could be trusted. He spoke first, without turning his head. He told her that the wound had been cleaned and dressed, that she was in the Veltanov estate, and that no one else was in the room. He told her she was safe, and then he paused, because he was not entirely sure that was true, and he suspected she would know immediately if he said something he did not mean. She sat up slowly. He heard the small sound she made when the movement pulled at her ribs, and he did not comment on it because she would not want him to. He had already understood that much about her. When he finally turned to look at her, she was upright, both feet on the floor, her ruined coat folded across her lap with a tidiness that struck him as almost defiant. Her grey eyes were clear. Whatever vulnerability sleep had left on her face was already being put away, packed down beneath composure the way one packs valuables before a journey, quickly, efficiently, with long practice. She told him her name was Isolde Varnvi. He did not recognize it. He told her so, and something crossed her face at that. Not surprise, but a kind of tired confirmation, as though she had expected precisely this, and found no comfort in being right. She said that she knew he would not. She said that was part of the problem. Radomir leaned forward in the chair, and rested his arms on his knees, and looked at her steadily. He had a talent for stillness that unnerved most people. His regiment had called it the quiet before the order. His estate manager called it the look that meant someone was about to have a very long conversation whether they wanted one or not. He fixed it on Isolde Varnvi and waited. She did not unravel. She looked back at him with those level grey eyes, and he felt, for the second time since pulling her from the snow, the unsettling sensation of meeting someone who was genuinely his equal in composure, which was not something that happened often and was frankly inconvenient given the circumstances. She told him that Alexei Drevsky was alive. The fire popped. Snow shifted on the roof with a low sound like a held breath released. Radomir did not move. She told him that Drevsky had not simply survived the imperial sentence. He had been helped. Someone inside the court had altered the record, replaced the body, and arranged passage out of the country 11 years ago. She did not yet know who. She had spent the last 3 years trying to find out, and it had cost her considerably. And the knife along her ribs the night before was the latest in a series of reminders that she was getting too close for someone's comfort. Radomir stood and walked to the window. The grounds were pale blue in the early light, undisturbed and clean, the night's violence already buried under fresh snow. He pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and thought about 11 years. About every decision he had made in the aftermath of the Drevsky verdict, the alliances he had formed on the assumption that that chapter was closed, the enemies he had not bothered to watch carefully because he had believed the most dangerous one was gone. He had built 11 years on a foundation that had never been solid, and he had not known. That was what sat in him now, heavy and unfamiliar, not fear. Radomir Tzvetnov did not have a simple relationship with fear. He had learned too young that fear was information, not instruction, and that the appropriate response to it was analysis, not paralysis. What he felt was something closer to fury at himself, a cold, precise anger directed inward at the part of him that had chosen comfortable certainty over rigorous doubt. He asked her how she had found his estate. She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him that she had been watching Drevsky's movements for several months and that, in recent weeks, his movements had begun to orbit the Veltanov lands with a frequency that was not coincidence. She had come to warn him. She had not anticipated that Drevsky's men would reach her before she reached the house. Radomir turned from the window. He asked her why she was doing this, who she was to Drevsky, or to the court, or to any of it. A woman alone, 3 years of investigation, a knife wound in the dark. None of it arrived without a reason that mattered personally, and he was not interested in the version of the story she had, rehearsed for strangers. Something shifted in her face. It was brief, barely a flicker, but he saw it. A crack in that extraordinary composure, something raw and old moving beneath the surface before she pressed it back down. She told him that Alexei Drevsky had been her father's closest friend, that her father had been implicated in the treason charge alongside Drevsky, had been convicted on evidence she believed was manufactured, and had died in prison 4 years ago without ever seeing his name cleared. She was the only person left who knew the full shape of what had happened, and the only person still willing to say so out loud. And she had learned 3 months ago that Drevsky himself had been the one who provided the false evidence against her father. The man her father had trusted above all others had destroyed him, had let him rot in a cell and die there while he himself escaped, and built a new life somewhere beyond the Empire's reach, and was now, for reasons she had not yet fully understood, returning. The room was very still. Radomir looked at her. at the steadiness she was maintaining at considerable cost, at the grief she was refusing to perform, at the fury she had compressed into something cold and functional and aimed like a blade at a very specific target. And he felt something he had not expected to feel, which was recognition. He knew what it was to carry something like that. He knew what it did to a person over years, how it sharpened some things and quietly destroyed others, how it sat in the chest at night, in the particular way that only betrayal sits, heavier than ordinary loss, because it required you to revise, not just the present, but everything you had ever believed was true. His brother had done something not entirely unlike what Drevsky had done to her father. Not treason, not death, but a particular and precise destruction that had left Radomir at 24, inheriting not just an estate, but the wreckage of his family's standing, the debts his brother had, hidden, and the knowledge that the person he had loved most completely had been, in some fundamental way, someone else entirely. He had rebuilt. He had done it alone, and he had done it well. And he had told himself that the doing of it was enough, that competence was its own consolation. Looking at Isolde Varnvi, he was not entirely sure he had been right about that. He told her to rest. He told her that the conversation was not finished, but that she was not yet well enough for the rest of it, and that he needed several hours to think, and to send word to a man in the city who owed him a significant favour and would know things about Drevsky's current whereabouts that could not be obtained any other way. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, quietly, whether he had found his dog. He had not. That fact had not left him for a single moment of the night, sitting beneath everything else, like a splinter beneath skin. He told her no. Her expression changed then, just slightly. Not pity. She was not the kind of woman who offered pity carelessly, but something careful and knowing, as though the missing dog meant something to her beyond the obvious. Something she was not yet ready to say, he noticed. He filed it away. He was beginning to understand that with Isolde Varnvi, everything she did not say immediately was something she would eventually say, and that patience was going to be the only currency that worked between them. He left the room. He stood in the hallway outside the closed door for a moment with his hand still on the frame, and he thought about a dead man walking, and a woman who had come through the dark to warn him, and a dog that had not come home. Something was already in motion. It had been in motion for some time. The only question now was whether he had learned about it early enough to matter. He was not yet sure of the answer. Radomir's contact in the city was a man named Fyodor Ulchenkov, who had spent 30 years moving between the imperial court and the criminal underbelly of St. Petersburg with the ease of a man who had never fully belonged to either, and therefore owed nothing to both. He was not a friend. He was something more useful than a friend. He was a person who remembered everything and needed money with enough regularity that his memory was reliably available. The reply came back faster than Radomir had expected. By midday, a rider had returned from the city with a sealed note that contained exactly 4 lines. He read them standing in the courtyard in the cold, and then he read them again, and then he folded the paper and put it inside his coat against his chest, which was not something he did with ordinary information. He stood there for a moment with his breath making clouds in the still air, and thought about what 4 lines could do to 11 years of assumption. Drevsky had been in St. Petersburg for 6 weeks. He was living under a different name in a house on the eastern quarter, a house that, according to Fyodor, had been purchased 3 years ago by a member of the Imperial Privy Council, whose name Radomir recognized immediately and wished he did not. The council member's name was Brentin Solikov, and he was a man Radomir had sat across from at dinner tables, had exchanged correspondence with, had considered, if not an ally, then at least a known and manageable presence in the architecture of his professional life. 6 weeks. Drevsky had been in the city for 6 weeks, and Solikov had been housing him for 3 years, which meant this was not a sudden resurgence. This was a plan, something with structure and patience behind it, something that had been building quietly while Radomir attended dinners and managed estates and believed the dangerous chapter was closed. He went back inside. Isolde was not on the settee where he had left her. He found her in the library, standing at the shelves along the eastern wall, with a book open in her hands, and her bandaged side turned slightly away from the light, in the way of someone managing pain. Without drawing attention to it, she had found clean clothes somewhere. His housekeeper's doing, sensible woman. And her hair was pinned back with a simplicity that suited her face better than elaborate arrangement would have. She looked, standing there in the grey morning light among his books, like someone who had always been in that room, which was a disorienting thought, and he pushed it aside immediately. She looked up when he entered, and read his face before he had said a single word. She asked him what Fyodor had told him. He considered briefly, giving her a measured version, a partial truth, the kind he would offer a person whose full allegiances he had not yet confirmed. He was a careful man by nature and by practice, and caution had served him well for a long time. But she had come through the dark with a knife wound in her side, and one word on her lips, and she had not lied to him yet, and caution, he was beginning to understand, was going to be a luxury he could not fully afford in whatever was coming. He told her about Solokhov. Her reaction was not what he expected. She did not look surprised. She looked, instead, like someone watching a thing they had feared become confirmed, the specific exhaustion of a suspicion proven true. She closed the book carefully and set it on the shelf and turned to face him fully. She told him that she had suspected a council connection for over a year, that the evidence trail she had been following kept leading back toward the court rather than away from it, which had made the investigation considerably more dangerous and considerably more difficult to pursue openly. She told him that she had not known which council member. She said Solokhov's name quietly, and something in the way she said it told him she was rearranging things in her mind, slotting this new piece into a structure she had been building for a long time. Then she said something that stopped him entirely. She told him that her father had known Solokhov, that the two of them had been part of the same circle as Drevsky, 20 years ago, before everything fractured. She said she had always believed Solokhov had been a peripheral figure in the original conspiracy, someone who had known more than he admitted and chosen silence over honesty. But if he had been housing Drevsky for 3 years, if he had helped arrange the escape 11 years ago, then he was not peripheral. He was the center of it. He had always been the center of it, and everyone, including her father, had been looking at the wrong man. The weight of that landed in the room, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Radomir moved to the desk and sat down. He looked at the surface of it, at the collar that was still lying where he had left it the night before, and he picked it up and turned it in his hands the way he had turned it a dozen times already, not because he expected it to tell him something new, but because the physical act of holding it helped him think. He asked her about Boria. She was quiet for long enough that he looked up. Her expression had changed. The composure was still there, but it was doing more work now, visibly, the way a wall does more work when the water behind it rises. She moved from the shelves and sat in the chair across from his desk, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with grey eyes that were not quite steady. She told him that the night before, in the wood, before Drevsky's men had found her, she had found the dog first. Radomir went very still. She said Boria was alive. She wanted him to know that first, before anything else. He was alive, and he had not been harmed, but he had not been lost. He had been taken, and he had been taken deliberately, and she believed she knew why. She told him that Drevsky's men had been using the dog to map the estate. Boria knew the grounds completely. Every patrol route, every gap in the fence line, every place where a man could pass from the tree line to the house without crossing a lantern's light. A well-trained wolfhound moved those routes instinctively and repeatedly, and anyone watching him carefully for even 2 or 3 nights would have a detailed picture of the estate's vulnerabilities, without ever setting foot on the grounds themselves. Taking him was not cruelty. It was strategy. They had what they needed from him. And now they were using his absence to send a message, to let Radomir know that someone had been watching long enough and closely enough to use his own dog as a map. Radomir set the collar down on the desk. He asked her, very quietly, how she knew all of this. She held his gaze. She did not look away, which he respected, because what she said next required either courage or recklessness, and he was not yet certain which one was driving her. She told him that 3 weeks ago she had made contact with one of Drevsky's men, not as herself, under a false name, with a fabricated introduction, presenting herself as someone with a grievance against the Veltanov estate, who might be persuaded to provide useful information. She had done it to get close enough to understand what Drevsky was planning, and she had done it alone because there was no one else, and she had done it knowing that if her identity was discovered, she would not survive the discovery. Her identity had been discovered 4 days ago. The knife in the birch wood was the result. Radomir looked at her for a long time. He was aware of something shifting in him that he did not entirely welcome, a kind of involuntary regard that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the specific quality of what she had just described. She had walked into the middle of a dangerous man's operation, alone, with nothing but her own intelligence and nerve to protect her, and she had done it for her father, for a dead man who could not know she was trying, and she had nearly died for it the night before, and she was sitting across from him now, with her hands folded, and her spine straight and her grey eyes level, and she was not asking him for anything. That, more than any of it, was what got beneath his composure. He told her that she was not going to do anything alone from this point forward. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite gratitude, and not quite resistance, but something between them, complicated and unresolved. The expression of someone who had been managing alone for long enough that the offer of help arrived like a language they had almost forgotten they once knew. He told her that he was going to get his dog back. He told her that Solikov was going to answer for 11 years of comfortable treachery. He told her that Drevsky had made the mistake of coming back, and that people who made that kind of mistake in his direction had a consistent history of regretting it. He said all of this in an even voice, looking directly at her, and he meant every word of it with a thoroughness that surprised even himself. Outside, the snow had stopped. The grounds were silent and white and deceptively peaceful, and somewhere beyond the birch wood, in a city full of people who did not yet know what was about to move, a man who had been dead for 11 years was waiting for something. He was going to be waiting for considerably less time than he thought. But there was a knock at the library door before Radomir could say another word, and his estate manager entered with a face that had gone the particular colour of a man carrying news that cannot be softened, and he told Radomir that one of the men sent into the wood the night before had been found at the edge of the north fence. He was alive, but just, and pinned to his coat was a note with 2 words on it, that the estate manager read aloud in a voice that had gone almost entirely flat with the effort of steadiness. "Come alone." Radomir read the 2 words 3 times. Then he folded the note and put it in his coat pocket beside Fyodor's message, and he looked at his estate manager and told him to have the injured man brought inside and the physician sent for. Immediately, his voice was steady, his face was composed. These were things he had learned to maintain under pressure so thoroughly that they operated almost independently of whatever was happening beneath them. And what was happening beneath them right now was a cold, focused rage that had been building since the moment the stable boy had appeared, with a collar in his shaking hands. He turned to Isolde. She had already stood. She had read the estate manager's face before the words were out. and she was standing with her arms at her sides and her jaw set, and an expression that told him she understood exactly what the note meant and was already calculating. He told her he was going. She told him he was not going alone. The estate manager looked between them with the expression of a man who had learned over many years of service that there were conversations it was wiser not to witness. And he excused himself quietly and closed the library door behind him. Radomir looked at Isolde. She looked back at him. The fire in the grate had burned down to deep red coals, and the room was dim and close, and the silence between them had a texture to it, the texture of two people who had arrived at the same conclusion from different directions, and were only now acknowledging that the directions no longer mattered. He told her that going together doubled the risk, that Drevsky's instruction was specific, and that deviating from it immediately told him they had compared information, which collapsed whatever marginal advantage surprise still gave them. She told him that going alone told Drevsky he had rattled him badly enough to abandon judgment, which was worse. He stared at her. She was right. He did not say so, but she saw it in his face and did not press the point, which he appreciated more than he would have admitted. They left an hour before dusk. She rode well, better than he had expected, though he recognized immediately that he needed to stop being surprised by her competencies, because she had demonstrated enough of them in the past. 24 hours that surprise was no longer a reasonable response. She rode beside him through the birch wood, with her spine straight, and her eyes moving constantly across the tree line, and he found himself watching her watch the woods, and thinking that she had been doing this alone for 3 years, and that the specific kind of courage that required was not the loud kind, not the kind that announced itself and drew admiration, but the quiet, grinding kind that got up every morning and kept going in the absence of any guarantee that it would ever be enough. His brother had been the loud kind of brave, spectacular and visible and ultimately hollow. It had taken Radomir years to understand that. The meeting point was a gamekeeper's cottage at the northern edge of the estate, a building he knew well, which told him that whoever had sent the note knew his land as thoroughly as he did, which brought him back to Boria, to the patient, systematic use of his own dog as a surveying tool, and the rage beneath his composure sharpened into something harder and more specific. They dismounted at the tree line and went the last 100 yards on foot. The cottage had a light in it, one candle, visible through the single window, which was either an invitation or a deliberate exposure of the person inside, and the deliberateness of it suggested someone who was not afraid of being seen, which in turn suggested someone who believed they were in complete control of whatever was about to happen. Radomir pushed the door open. The man inside was not Drevsky. He was older than Radomir had expected, somewhere in his 60s, with white hair and a stillness that was entirely different from Radomir's own stillness. Where Radomir's was controlled, disciplined, this man's was the stillness of someone who had simply stopped caring what his body communicated. He was seated at the cottage's small table, with his hands folded on the surface, and a cup of tea in front of him, and he looked up when they entered with an expression of absolute unsurprise. It was Brentin Solikov, not a representative, not a message. The man himself, sitting in a gamekeeper's cottage on Radomir's land, drinking tea, as though the audacity of the location was itself part of the communication. Radomir stepped inside. He was aware of Isolde moving to his left, positioning herself at an angle that gave her a view of both Solikov and the door, and he filed that away as something to think about later, the ease with which she had moved into tactical positioning without discussion or instruction. Solikov looked at her. Something moved in his face, old and complicated, and he said her surname quietly, not as a question but as a recognition. She said nothing. Radomir pulled the second chair from the table and sat down across from Solikov and looked at him with the full weight of the quiet, that had unnerved men considerably more formidable than an aging council member, and he waited. Solokhov told him that he had not come to threaten him. He said it with the weariness of a man delivering a truth nobody was going to believe immediately. And he was correct that Radomir did not believe it immediately, but something in the weariness itself was interesting enough to keep him listening. Solokhov told him that he had made a catastrophic mistake 11 years ago, and that he had spent 11 years watching the consequences of it grow larger and more dangerous, and that Drevsky was no longer a man he controlled or sheltered. Drevsky had inverted the arrangement somewhere in the past 3 years, had accumulated enough evidence of Solokhov's original involvement in the escape that the shelter had become captivity, the funding had become extortion, and the house on the eastern quarter had become a prison Solokhov entered voluntarily every month because the alternative was exposure and the end of everything. He told them that Drevsky's plan was not revenge against Radomir, or not primarily. Radomir was a piece of it, a significant piece, because the Veltanov estate's proximity to the northern supply roads made it strategically valuable for what Drevsky was actually planning, which was not a personal settling of scores, but a second attempt, not at simple treason, at something larger, a manufactured crisis, a specific sequence of events designed to destabilize the imperial succession at a moment when the court was already fractured enough that a well-placed shock might crack it entirely. The room was very quiet. Radomir looked at the old man across the table and sorted through everything he had said for the internal consistency that separated truth from performance, and found it, which was almost worse than finding lies would have been. He asked where Drevsky was now. Solokhov told him that Drevsky had left the city 2 days ago, that he was moving toward the estate with 6 men, and that his timeline had accelerated because Isolde's infiltration, even after discovery, had spooked him into compressing his plan. He had originally intended to wait another month. He was no longer waiting. Radomir's jaw tightened. He asked about the dog. Solokhov told him that Boria was in the koch's back room, that he had insisted on it as a gesture of good faith before this meeting, over Drevsky's explicit objection, and that the objection had cost Solokhov something he would probably pay for later. Isolde moved before Radomir did. She crossed to the back door and pushed it open, and there was a sound, immediate and unmistakable, the sound of a large animal recognizing a familiar presence, and Radomir heard her say something, quietly, in a tone he had not yet heard from her, something unguarded and relieved. And when he turned, she was crouched in the doorway, with Boria's enormous grey head pressed against her chest, and her eyes closed, and her hand moving steadily along his neck. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he turned back to Solokhov, and told him that if anything he had said was exaggerated or falsified in any detail, the consequences would be severe and immediate. Solokhov nodded, as though he had expected nothing less, and looked, if anything, slightly relieved to be in the presence of someone who operated in clear terms. Radomir told him that he was going to need everything, every name, every date, every piece of correspondence that still existed, every detail of Drevsky's plan that Solokhov had access to. He told him that the exchange for that information was protection, which Solokhov would receive not because he deserved it, but because he was more useful, alive and cooperative, than dead and unavailable. Solokhov said he understood. Outside, the last of the daylight was going. Radomir stood and moved toward Isolde, who had straightened and was looking at him with Boria pressing against her leg, and her grey eyes carrying something new in them, something that had not been there in the snow the night before or in the library that morning, something that looked like the very beginning of trust, not given freely, not fully formed, but present, tentative and real. He reached down and put his hand briefly on Boria's head. The dog pushed up into his palm, and he felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was still clenched. He told Isolde that they needed to move quickly, that they had perhaps 18 hours before Drevsky reached the estate, and that those hours needed to count. She asked him what he was planning. He told her that he was planning to stop waiting for Drevsky to come to him. Her expression shifted, and for the first time since he had pulled her from the snow, she looked at him with something that was not purely strategic, something that recognized him as a person rather than a variable in her calculation. And the recognition was brief and unspoken, and landed in him with a weight that was entirely disproportionate to the moment. They left Solikov in the cottage with two of Radomir's most trusted men and rode back through the dark wood with Borya running alongside them. And the estate lights came into view through the trees ahead, and Radomir rode beside Isolde Varnvi in the cold dark, and understood with the clarity of a man who has spent too long being only careful that careful was no longer going to be enough. Something was going to have to give. In the plan, in the danger, in the distance, he had maintained between himself and everything that threatened to matter too much. He was not yet ready to say which one it would be. Drevsky is coming. The plan is in motion, and the hours are running out. What happens when he arrives? And what will Radomir have to sacrifice to stop him? And what does Isolde still have left to tell him? They had 16 hours. Radomir spent the first 4 of them doing what he did best, which was converting chaos into structure. He sent riders to 3 neighbouring estates, whose owners he trusted not for their warmth, but for their self-interest. Men who would understand immediately that a destabilization of the imperial succession was bad for everyone with land and title and something to lose. He sent a separate rider to a colonel in the imperial garrison 2 hours north, a man who owed him a debt that had never been formally acknowledged, and therefore never formally repaid. He laid out everything Solikov had given them across the library desk and went through it with Isolde piece by piece, and she was faster than him at certain parts of it. The parts that required understanding the court's internal architecture, the relationships and pressure points and old injuries that determined how people would move when threatened. He watched her work and did not interrupt her. She had a mind that operated the way good engineering operated, quietly, without display, producing results that only looked simple because of how thoroughly the complexity had been managed. Underneath, he had met intelligent people before. He had not often met people whose intelligence felt like a genuine counterpart to his own, rather than a comparison or a competition. And the discovery of it now. In the middle of the worst night his estate had seen in a generation, was the kind of thing that arrived at precisely the wrong moment and refused to be ignored. By the second hour she had identified 3 weaknesses in Drevsky's documented plan. By the third, she had suggested a revision to Radomir's defensive positioning that he adopted without argument because it was simply better than what he had proposed. By the 4th hour, the fire had burned low again, and the house was quiet around them, and they were the only 2 people still awake in it. And she set down the last of Solikov's papers and pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes and exhaled slowly. He poured 2 glasses from the decanter on the sideboard and set one in front of her without asking. She looked at it. Then she picked it up and drank, and did not comment, which he was beginning to understand. Was her version of thank you when she was too tired for the full architecture of courtesy. He asked her what she had not told him yet. She looked up. The question did not surprise her. She had been waiting for it, he could see that, had been carrying it through the entire evening's work, with the specific posture of someone who has decided to say a thing, but has not yet decided when. She told him that when she was inside Drevsky's circle, in those 3 weeks under a false name, she had found something beyond the estate maps and the timeline. She had found a list. Names, 8 of them, people Drevsky intended to eliminate in the aftermath of the succession crisis. People whose removal would clear the path for whoever he was positioning to step into the vacuum. She had memorized all 8 names, because writing them down was too dangerous. The seventh name on the list was Radomir's. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the birch wood with a sound like distant water. He told her that she had known this since she arrived at his estate. She said yes. He asked her why she had not said it immediately. She looked at him with those grey eyes that were exhausted now and completely unguarded in a way that the daylight hours had not allowed. And she told him that she had come to warn him about Drevsky because it was the right thing to do, but that when she had found his name on that list, she had understood for the first time that this was no longer simply about her father, about clearing a dead man's name and making Drevsky answer for what he had done. It had become about Radomir specifically, about keeping a specific person alive, and the transition between those two things had frightened her considerably more than the knife in the birch wood. The room was very still. He did not look away from her, and she did not look away from him, and the fire made small sounds in the grate, and Boria, lying across the hearthrug, exhaled in his sleep, and neither of them moved. He told her that he was not easy to kill. She told him she was aware of that. She said she had done the research. Something shifted in his chest, slow and irrevocable, the feeling of a weight that has been in one position for so long that moving it changes the entire balance of everything around it. He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, briefly, without pressure, just the fact of it, the simple physical acknowledgement of everything that had been building since the snow. She looked down at his hand. Then she turned hers over beneath it, just slightly, and that small movement cost her something. He could see it in her face. The deliberate overriding of 3 years of operating alone, and he understood exactly what it cost, because it cost him something equivalent to accept it. They did not say anything else. There was nothing that needed to be said that the silence was not already saying more precisely. Drevsky arrived at dawn. Not from the north road, as Solikov had indicated, from the east, through the gap in the fence line that Boria had mapped with his nightly runs, the gap that Radomir had left, deliberately unguarded, and very deliberately unwatched from any visible position, because he had spent the night placing his men somewhere else entirely. There were 6 of them, as Solikov had said, moving through the pale early light, in a formation that spoke of military training, purposeful and quiet, and very confident. They reached the east courtyard and stopped. Radomir stepped out of the stable door to meet them. He was alone. That was what they saw. One man, no coat, standing in the courtyard in the early light as though he had simply stepped outside for air. He watched their formation adjust, watched the confidence calibrate, watched the man at the center of the group register that this was either a trap or an extraordinary piece of arrogance, and watched him decide incorrectly that it was arrogance. The man at the center stepped forward. Radomir had not seen Alexei Drevsky in 11 years, and time had not been generous with him. He was thinner than the court portraits had shown him, with the particular leanness of a man who has been running for a long time and has forgotten how to stop, and his eyes had the brightness of someone who had been living on anticipation for years, and had finally arrived at the moment they had rehearsed endlessly in private. That brightness was the most dangerous thing about him. Obsession made people unpredictable in the final moments, because the outcome had ceased to matter to them as much as the performance of it. Drevsky told him that he had made it easy. Radomir said that was the general idea. The stable doors on both sides of the courtyard opened simultaneously. The colonel's men came from the left. Radomir's neighbour's men came from the right. 12 in total, enough for 6, with room to spare. And Drevsky's formation broke the way. Formations break when they realize the geometry has been wrong from the beginning, that the position they believed was an advantage was constructed specifically to contain them. There was a brief and ugly struggle. 2 of Drevsky's men ran and were collected at the fence line where Radomir had thought to put people the night before at Isolde's suggestion. One fought with genuine commitment and was subdued with matching commitment and no ceremony. Drevsky himself stood very still in the centre of the courtyard and watched it happen, with the brightness going out of his eyes in stages, the rehearsed ending of his long obsession dissolving into a cold and ordinary morning on someone else's land, surrounded by people he had not accounted for. Radomir walked toward him. He told Drevsky that Solikov had given them everything, every name, every date, every detail of the succession plan, and the list of people intended for removal. He told him that the information had gone to the imperial court the previous evening, and that by midday there would be people in the city with authority and instructions responding to it. Drevsky looked at him. The brightness was entirely gone now. What was left underneath it was older and hollower, the face of someone who has spent so long being dangerous that they have forgotten what they are when the danger is removed. He asked how. Radomir told him that he had not done it alone. He said it simply, without elaboration. But he turned briefly as he said it, and Isolde was standing at the stable door behind him, composed and steady in the early light, and Drevsky looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to genuine feeling he had shown, and it was not rage. It was the look of a man recognizing the specific shape of his own defeat, understanding who had carried it and how far. She looked back at him without flinching. She owed him nothing, least of all flinching. The colonel's men took Drevsky, and what was left of his group, and the courtyard emptied gradually, until it was only Radomir and Isolde standing in the pale morning, Boria pressing against Radomir's leg, the estate silent and intact around them. She was looking at the gate where the last of the soldiers had passed through. Her face was doing something quiet and private, the face of someone laying something down after carrying it for a very long time. And he did not interrupt it, because some things needed a moment of silence to become real. Then she turned to him. She said her father's name would be cleared now, that the evidence Solikov had provided included the original manufactured testimony against him, which was enough to formally overturn the conviction. She said it steadily, and her voice only changed on the last word, only slightly, barely enough to hear. But he heard it. He told her that her father had raised someone extraordinary. He said it plainly, as a fact, because it was one, and because she deserved to hear it plainly rather than gently. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said that she had nowhere immediate to go, that 3 years of living in motion had left her without a fixed point. And she said it as a statement, but there was a question underneath it, careful and undemanding, the question of a person who has learned that asking directly carries a risk they are only beginning to consider worth taking. He told her that the Veltanov estate had a considerable library and a serious shortage of people who could read Solikov's court documents without assistance. She looked at the house. Then she looked at him. The early light was coming fully now, pale gold across the snow, and she was standing in it with her grey eyes warm for the first time since he had found her. And she said that she supposed she could stay until the documents were sorted. He said that the documents were extensive. She said that she was patient. Boria walked between them and sat down with the authority of a dog, who has been the subject of considerable drama, and feels it has earned a resolution. And Radomir looked down at him and felt something settle in his chest that had not been settled in a very long time. The documents took 4 days. That was not because there were so many of them, though there were, but because reading them properly meant reading them together, comparing what Solikov had written against what Isolde carried in, memory, cross-referencing dates and court records that arrived by courier on the 2nd day from a contact of Fyodor's in the Imperial Archive. They worked at the library desk for long hours, and the work was meticulous and sometimes painful, particularly for Isolde, who kept finding her father's name in places it should not have been, and each time had to set the document down briefly and look at the window and breathe before she could continue. Radomir did not comment on these pauses. He simply waited through them, and she came back each time with her composure restored and continued. and he understood that this was how she honoured her grief, by refusing to let it interrupt the work the grief had created, and he found that he could not admire it from a distance because it was too close to the way he had learned to function himself. And recognizing yourself in someone else's private discipline was an intimacy that required no words and was not reducible to any. On the third day, a reply came from the imperial court confirming receipt of the evidence package. The reply was formal and brief, and contained between its careful official lines the unmistakable tone of an institution that had been caught off guard and was managing its exposure with maximum efficiency and minimum acknowledgement. Radomir read it and showed it to Isolde, and she read it twice and set it down and said nothing for a moment. Then she said that it was enough, that the formal receipt meant the record would be reopened, that her father's conviction would be reviewed, and that, however long the process took, and however little fanfare attended it, the truth was now inside the machine that had originally distorted it, and could not be extracted without leaving a mark. He told her that it would be more than a mark, that he intended to ensure it. She looked at him. She asked what that meant. He told her that he had written separately to two members of the court who were neither Solokov's allies nor his enemies, but simply men who valued their own reputations enough to want to be on the correct side of a revision, and that he had made clear in both letters that the Veltanov name and attention would remain on the Varnvi case until the outcome was formal and public and sufficient. He said it without drama, as a statement of completed action, because that was how he did things, and he watched her face as she understood what it meant to have someone use genuine weight in the world on behalf of something that mattered to her. She looked down at the desk. When she looked up, her eyes were bright, and she did not attempt to hide it, which told him more about how far they had come in 4 days than anything else could have. She told him that she did not know how to accept help gracefully, that she had been operating without it for long enough that the mechanics of it felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, like a coat cut for a different person that she was still learning to wear. He told her that she was doing considerably better than she thought. She laughed. It was brief and a little surprised, the laugh of someone who had not expected to find that particular thing in that particular moment. And the sound of it in the quiet library did something to the air of the room that neither of them addressed directly. On the 4th day they finished. The last document was a sworn statement from Solokov, detailed and comprehensive, the confession of a man who had decided that the only remaining form of dignity available to him was thoroughness. Isolde read the final page and set it on the completed pile and smoothed the edge of it with one finger and sat back in her chair. The library was very quiet. Snow was falling outside, the soft, unhurried kind, and the grounds were white and undisturbed, and the house felt, for the first time since she had arrived in it, entirely peaceful. Radomir watched her sit in that peace for a moment. He watched her let herself have it, the completion, the exhale of 3 years of forward motion, arriving finally at a place where it was permitted to stop. And he thought about what it cost a person to carry something that long and what it left behind when it was set down, the specific unfamiliar lightness of a life that no longer has a single consuming purpose, organizing every decision. He knew that feeling. He had felt it at 28, when the last of his brother's debts had been cleared, and the estate had returned to solvency, and he had stood in this same library on a winter morning, and felt, beneath the relief, the vertiginous absence of the weight he had organized himself around for 4 years. He had not known what to do with himself for approximately 3 weeks, and had dealt with it by finding new problems to solve immediately, which was a strategy he now recognized as efficient, but not particularly nourishing. He told her that. She turned to look at him, slightly surprised that he had offered it, and he understood the surprise, because he did not typically offer things like that. Personal history served plainly, without reason beyond the wish to be honest with her. She asked him what he had done after the 3 weeks. He told her that he had started building, that the west wing of the estate had been in disrepair since his father's time, and he had spent the following year restoring it, not because it was urgently needed, but because his hands and his mind had required occupation, and the building had given it to him. He told her it was the wing they were sitting in. She looked around the library with new attention, at the shelves he had commissioned, and the plaster work, and the windows he had replaced with larger ones, to let in the winter light, that the old ones had blocked, and something in her expression softened in a way that made the room feel smaller and closer, and considerably less like a professional arrangement. He asked her where she intended to go. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow continued its soft, indifferent falling, and Boria shifted in front of the fire, with a sound of deep contentment, and the question sat in the room between them, not urgent, not pressured, simply present in the way that honest questions are. She told him that she did not have an answer to that yet. She told him that the shape of her life for 3 years had been defined entirely by what she was moving toward, and she had not considered what came after, because considering after had felt like a presumption, like counting something before it was certain. She had not allowed herself to imagine a life on the other side of this, and now that she was standing in it, she found it unmapped and open in a way that was equal parts frightening, and something she did not yet have a word for. He told her that unmapped was not the same as empty. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the full steadiness that was simply his nature, not performed, not strategic, just the way he occupied space in the world, entirely and without apology. And she felt, as she had felt several times in the past 4 days, the particular quality of being seen by someone who looked without agenda, who was not looking for a version of her that was useful or manageable or comfortable, but simply for what was actually there. It was the most frightening thing he did. She told him so. He said that he was aware. She stood from the desk and moved to the window and stood looking out at the snow and the white grounds and the birch wood at the far edge of the light, and he came and stood beside her, close but not, touching the way he had learned to be present with her, near enough to matter, not so close as to crowd the space she needed to think in. She told him that her father used to say that the only honest way to build anything was to start with what you actually had rather than what you wished you had, because the wishing was a form of dishonesty that infected everything built on top of it. She said he had meant it about practical things, about land management and finances, but that she had always thought it applied to other things too. He asked her what she actually had. She turned to look at him. They were very close, in the window light, close enough that he could see the precise colour of her eyes, which were not simply grey but had something warmer underneath, something that had been present since the courtyard in the early light, and had been becoming more visible by increments as the days passed. She told him that she had the rest of Solokov's contacts to run down, which would take time, and would be considerably easier with access to a library, a courier network, and a man who apparently had the attention of the imperial court when he chose to direct it. He told her that all of those things were available. She told him that she had a great deal of court documentation still to analyze, which required a desk, reasonable warmth, and someone willing to argue with her interpretations when they were wrong. He told her that he was available for that specifically. She told him that she had, unexpectedly, a very large dog who appeared to have decided she was his and who would require exercise and attention and a stable situation. He looked down at Boria, who had appeared silently at their feet in the way of large dogs who understand when important conversations are happening and position themselves to influence outcomes. He told her that Boria's judgment in these matters had always been reliable. She looked at the dog, then she looked at Radomir, and the careful distance she had maintained, even in their closest moments, the professional half-step back, that 3 years of solitary operation had built into her as thoroughly as breathing shifted, and she let it shift, deliberately, the way she did everything, with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She told him that she supposed she was staying then. He told her that the documents were still extensive. She told him that she had already said she was patient. He reached out and took her hand, not briefly this time, not the tentative gesture of the library desk in the small hours, but fully and with intention, and she looked down at their hands and then up, at him, and the warmth that had been building underneath the grey of her eyes for 4 days was entirely visible now, clear and unguarded, and certain in the way that things are certain when they have been examined carefully and found to hold. He told her that he was glad she came through the dark. She told him that she was glad someone was watching when she did. Outside, the snow fell on the white grounds, and the birch wood, and the north fence, where the world beyond the estate continued its motion, full of courts and councils, and the long, slow machinery of justice beginning to turn in a dead man's favour. Inside the library, the fire burned, and the documents were stacked and completed on the desk, and Borya lay across both their feet with the satisfaction of a creature who has orchestrated events to his preferred conclusion and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. Radomir looked at the woman beside him in the window light. This woman who had walked out of the dark with a knife wound and 1 word and 3 years of grief, and the most precise and uncompromising mind he had encountered in his life, and he thought about what unmapped looked like, the actual territory of it, the open, undecided future of 2 people who had found each other at the worst possible moment, and had not managed to find a reason to look away. He could not think of a single thing wrong with it. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was small and quiet, and entirely deliberate, and he turned his head slightly toward hers, and the library held them both in its winter light, and the snow went on, falling outside, soft and patient and entirely indifferent, covering everything old, and making the ground clean. What will Isolde find when she finishes Solokov's remaining contacts, and what does the road ahead look like for 2 people who have only just begun to map it? Will the imperial court deliver what her father deserved? And what will it cost when it does? Please subscribe to this channel right now and never miss what comes next.